Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Ashley, and if you're new here, this is Heebee Jeebeez TV. We like to talk about crime, creepy, and unbelievable stories. Now, before we get into today's video, of course, just sending you guys a quick little reminder to please comment, like, subscribe, especially hit the like button. It really does help me grow here on YouTube, and it helps get my video out there to people who are interested in these sorts of topics. Now, if you guys want more crime, creepy, and unbelievable content, check out my TikTok. I post a lot more content on there daily. I will link it in the description box for you guys. So if you're into that, take a second and check it out. All right, so let's get into today's story. Now, continuing the pattern of last week's video about creepy forests, we're going to dive into what is apparently one of the most haunted forests in the world, known as the Epping Forest in England. And surprisingly, it's actually not that far from London. It's considered to be part of Greater London, specifically in the heart of Essex. Like all haunted places though, the Epping Forest has a very dark history to match, and its history actually goes way back to the time of the Roman Empire. One particular spirit is said to still roam the darkness of the forest, and that is of the great warrior Queen Boudica. Now, if you haven't heard of her, you're not alone. I didn't know who she was either. So let's go into her a little bit more. So Queen Boudica was an ancient queen of the British Iceni tribe who bravely fought against the invasion of the Roman Empire. Although her and her people were able to put a huge dent into the Roman military, they were able to eliminate approximately 70,000 of their soldiers, but unfortunately she would go on to be defeated. Many of her battles were fought throughout the land of the Epping Forest, so you can only imagine the amount of energetic footprint that has been implanted or imprinted into the land. The history of the Epping Forest also passes through the Iron Age between the years 1200 and 600 BC, when humans first started introducing tools and weapons made from iron and steel, followed by the stories of Norman invaders who were raiding villages for food, money, and whatever materials they could grab. So you can only imagine here not just Queen Boudica's legacy and what happened there, but also a lot of traumatic events. With all of these sorts of raids, there are definitely a lot of people who lost their lives in this forest. In the 12th century, King Henry II actually declared this as a royal forest, meaning that only monarchs had permission to hunt in the forest for deer. However, that would change over the hundreds of years. And although the monarchy does hold hunting and associated rights to the forest, it has been privately owned by multiple citizens who do take care of the forest as much as they can. In the 18th century, unfortunately, the forest did fall victim to what we know as highwaymen, which are essentially burglars who prey on people crossing through what they called a highway back then. This essentially meant that they would target wealthy people who had enough money to travel by carriage and horse from London to Newmarket. And one of these notorious highwaymen is one that we're going to talk about a little bit more, and he's known as Richard Turpin. So if you are British or are just into history, you've probably already heard of Richard Turpin. He is quite famous in that realm, but if you have no idea who he is, let me tell you a little bit more about him. So you see, Richard Turpin was born at the Bluebell Inn in Hampstead, Essex, and was the fifth of 6 children. His father was a butcher and an innkeeper, while his mother took care of the home and the children. As he was growing up, of course, he was exposed to his father's trade and would eventually follow in his footsteps. He would spend quite a lot of time learning about the art of butchering, which eventually inspired him to open his own shop in 1725. However, things took a very dark turn for Richard. Sometime in the 1730s, he was said to have joined the Essex gang, which was known for stealing deers and were quite notorious. At the time, deer poaching was considered to be illegal and a serious offense, which was being fought aggressively by the civil courts and, of course, the Duke of Newcastle at the time. Now, because the Essex gang was in the business of stealing deer, and selling it off for pieces, they really needed some help in the butchering department. And that's when they discovered Richard Turpin. And not only was he skilled in butchering deer and livestock, he also had a shop in the area, which would make it extremely easy for these thieves to funnel their captures. And of course, as you can imagine, Richard was making a lot more money helping out these criminals than he would just running his own little family shop. And this would eventually lead him to change career paths. He stopped being a butcher, but then he ended up opening an inn called the Rose and Claw while still helping out his friends of the Essex gang. However, by 1734, most of the members of the Essex gang had been captured, but not Richard. He and a few of the associates were still on the loose, and with dwindling numbers, they needed a plan B to keep making money. So instead of stealing deer, at this point they decided to start robbing people's homes all across Greater London. In October of 1734, their first official robbery was recorded, and it was that of a man named Peter Split, who owned a grocery shop. For the rest of the year, they would target many more homes, taking everything they could, but for the most part, they did look for money. It was even reported that one robbery, they managed to escape with £300, which in today's currency is equivalent to 51,000 British pounds. After seeing how much they could actually really get away with, they only increased in aggressivity and how many homes they could target. And they actually became quite violent, with a few of their victims unfortunately passing away during these attacks. That is until the winter of 1735, when they raided a well-known farm in Marylebone. That's when the real hunt for these thieves began, and a large monetary reward was announced and posted for information that led to the capture of these thieves. It would only take a few days, but many of the gang members would end up being captured when their horses were recognized at a local bar. Witnesses recalled seeing those particular horses and men during the robbery, which eventually led to their capture. However, luckily, Richard would end up escaping and dodge justice once again. At this point, Richard knew that they could no longer continue raiding homes. There was just way too much attention on them. People were aware of what was going on, so they had to figure out something else to do. So Richard at this point finally turned to highway robbery, using the Epping Forest as his hideaway location for these ambushes. Him and another man named Thomas Roden would end up hiding in the forest line, and once they would see a vulnerable person passing by, they would jump in and do their thing. Being familiar with the forest, they would then take the victims to super isolated areas deep inside the forest to hide and eventually dispose of their remains. Time would eventually then lead him to meet another thief named Tong King, and together the two men continued to commit these atrocities, gaining notoriety across London. However, in 1733, Tom King ended up passing away due to a shot wound, and many actually suspect that it was Richard who dealt him this blow, all over an argument over a horse. Now alone and left to fend for himself, Richard would go out into the Epping Forest to hide until he was spotted by a man named Thomas Morris. Unfortunately for him, he would go on to become another victim of Richard Turpin, because he simply could not risk having a witness know exactly where he was hiding. After committing so many crimes and knowing that he was basically one of London's most wanted criminals, Richard then changed his name to John Palmer and ran off to hide in Yorkshire. But unfortunately, it didn't do him much good. On October 2nd, 1739, Richard was arrested for shooting another man's rooster while he was looking for food. Once in jail, he would go on to confess to also stealing horses. However, because authorities did not know that he had changed his name, he hadn't been charged with his long list of serious infractions. It wasn't until a huge coincidence that occurred that a man who had actually taught Richard to write, who was working at the post office at the time, recognized Richard's handwriting from a letter he had written from jail. Of course, he notifies the authorities, and this led to them exposing Richard's true identity, and from here he was sentenced to his dreaded fate. On April 7th, 1939, Richard Turpin was hung. Even though Richard Turpin was now gone, that was only the beginning of incredible gang activity within the Epping Forest. Because then came the Kray brothers, and these two were something else. And if you haven't heard of these guys, they do have a movie on them that was released a few years ago called Legend, and I believe it's available on Netflix, if not Amazon Prime, but it is a very intense movie. Now, the Kray brothers are very well known across England, across Europe, I would even say across the world, but the Kray brothers are actually identical twins who caused chaos everywhere they went. From the late 50s to the late 60s, the brothers were well known across London for being leaders of organized crime, along with their gang known as the Firm. They were involved in many illegal activities, including taking people's lives, arson, gambling, and of course assaults. By the 1960s, they had reached celebrity status, having owned nightclubs. They also made themselves part of the swinging London scene, which ended up leading them to rubbing elbows with basically every celebrity you can imagine. And let's just say they were not making their money in any sort of ethical way. If anything, these nightclubs, these restaurants, they were just kind of like a facade to hide what they were really doing. And with so much to hide, it's only a question of where do you think they went? Epping Forest ended up looking very good to the Kray brothers. Over the years, many of their victims were discovered within the Epping Forest, including Terry Gooderham and Maxine Arnold. They were found in their car in 1989, but that's just two of their victims. It's estimated that the victims of the Kray brothers is estimated to be about somewhere in the 30 range, and they're all suspected of being inside the Epping Forest. Then there's the tragic passing of the two young children who were found in the Epping Forest, and their case was famously known across England as the Babes in the Woods. Their lifeless bodies were unfortunately found in 1970 deep within the forest, and their names were Susan Blatford, who was just 11 years old, and Gary Hanlon, who was 12. Both children were said to have been lured away from their homes to the woods where evil in the form of Ronald Jebson was waiting for them. They were, of course, reported as missing by their parents, but it took 78 entire days for them to be discovered, and if you wouldn't believe it, 30 more years for their case to be solved. In 1998, Ronald Jebson would give in to his guilty conscience and confess to the crime after he had been sentenced to serve a life sentence for another senseless killing. He would then go on to pass away in prison in 2015. And even to this day, police are still finding bodies within the forest. It's almost as if the forest has become a type of dumping ground for criminals, similar to the Texas killing fields, which I'll link up here and in the description box if you guys are interested in that story. In April 2021, the lifeless body of missing student Richard Turpin was found in a pond inside Epping Forest. He had last been seen on CCTV footage shortly after midnight on March 23, 2021, walking towards the forested area. Police have no leads on the case, chalking it up to an unhappy teenager who chose to take his own life, but his mother, of course, believes otherwise, and she thinks that her son met with foul play. So, with so much heavy and negative energy in the forest, one can help but wonder if the tales of these hauntings are actually true. Well, witnesses swear by their accounts, which are actually numbered in the thousands. So let's go into a few of these stories. But in order to do that, we have to go back to the beginning. So there are tales of people hearing disembodied voices and cries of soldiers believed to go back to the time of Queen Boudica, and some even claim to hear the sounds of drums in the distance. There's a story of one elderly couple who was visiting the forest in the 90s, and as they were walking, they were taking photos, but then they were caught off guard by additional voices. It had just been the two of them, so of course this kind of shocked them. They were unprepared to hear other voices in the area. They stood in awe trying to figure out where these voices were coming from, but there was absolutely no one else there with them. All they could make out were the mumbles of three men talking amongst themselves, up until the very end when one of them clearly said, "But it's as if we don't come back." Then silence. So this leads us to ask if these are the spirits of soldiers who lost their lives on the battlefields. Then there's another story that actually goes back 300 years, and that's of a couple who unfortunately took their own lives at Lindsay Street Pond. It's said that these waters are cursed and actually draw people to submerge themselves. In the 1960s, one couple swears that they saw two dark black figures on horseback emerging from the water onto land, and just as quickly as they appeared, they simply vanished into thin air after a few seconds. The forest would go on to gain so much attention for its haunted reputation that the popular paranormal show called Most Haunted went on into the forest to do an investigation. And they fully believe that they did encounter the spirit of Richard Turpin, who was still up to his mischievous ways, luring them off the road to isolated areas. The crew also went on to experience strange whispers, uneasy feelings, and being touched by something unseen. One can't help but imagine that the ghost of Richard Turpin lurks in the darkness, trying to lure people away to their demise. There have been countless tales of a headless figure roaming the dirt roads, sometimes on foot and other times on horseback, waiting and stalking its next victim. Many suspect this headless figure to also be Richard since he was hung. That's how he was executed. It would only make sense for his spirit to appear in such a way. And of course, we cannot talk about Epping Forest without touching on Hangman Hill. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly which spirit is haunting here, but the legend goes that it was once a man who was in charge of dragging screaming criminals to their fate of hanging. And it seems that this spirit has actually stuck to his old ways because the act of dragging continues to this day. Visitors who park their car at the base of the hill have reported having their car ever so slowly dragged up the hill on its own, stopping once it reaches the top of the hill. And this has become quite a thing when it comes to Epping Forest. People actually travel from all across England, sometimes even Europe, to experience this strange phenomenon for themselves.
Break off. Are we going to roll uphill?
It's my right foot. It's my right foot.
No engine. Yeah, we are rolling up the hill. It does look like it's so weird. It's going uphill. That bit surely is uphill. We can't roll that bit.
Still rolling. And then when I let it stop naturally, will it roll backwards?
Oh, I can't see how the back bike's on there.
No, it's
No way! That's so weird.
One particular couple claimed to have seen the spirit of this alleged man when they were driving near the area. As they were at the top of the hills, the wife ends up turning, and out of the corner of her eye, she saw a man who looked very much out of place. And this was because he was dressed in very old clothing that she dated between sometime in the 17th and 18th century, and he basically just stood there staring at them before vanishing. Others have seen the spirit of an unknown female child wandering the forest on her own, and all they know about her is that she's seen wearing a light blue dress. However, as we step away from ghosts and spirits, we turn to cryptids because it wouldn't really be fitting to talk about a haunted forest, especially one in England, without a cryptid sighting or two. And specifically, we're going to talk about the Black Shuck. Now, the legend of the Black Shuck goes back to 1127 to the town of Peterborough, when a group of men spotted about 20 to 30 of these creatures lurking in the woods. Whatever those things were, they were reportedly staying there throughout all of Lent and Easter, which was approximately 50 days, kind of haunting and tormenting the locals. Some people say that the legend of the Black Shuck is nothing but make-believe, a result of people confusing the howling sounds of the wind as it makes its way through the streets and even the forest at night. But others believe it's something much more demonic. Soon enough, sightings of these creatures spread like wildfire across England, including Essex, Suffolk, Cambridge, Yorkshire, and many more regions. In 1577, there was a very bad thunderstorm, and locals were gathered at a church called the Holy Trinity Church in Blyberg. As everyone was praying and gathered together, the doors suddenly burst open, and an unknown creature ended up attacking everyone in the church. Sadly, 2 people would go on to pass away, but it was said that the animal ran through the church, destroying absolutely everything in its path until it fled. But before it did so, it ended up leaving very big claw marks on the doors, which are actually visible to this day. Later that evening, the animal was then said to have attacked 2 more people at another church approximately 12 miles away while the storm raged on. Witnesses described the animal as a very large black dog with mangy fur, but it was much larger, comparable to the size of a horse. It was also said to have been foaming at the mouth, almost as if it were some sort of rabid animal. But the most noticeable feature, and a feature that is repeated over and over again throughout sightings of the Black Shuck, is that it had big red glowing eyes. In 1905, a man came across a black unusual dog that supposedly shapeshifted into a donkey, but then it just vanished a few moments later right in front of his eyes. During the Second World War, there was a young girl who lived near a forest. One of these evenings, she was actually awoken by strange noises coming outside her window. She wakes up, of course, curious about what's making all that noise out there. So she gets up, looks out her window, and staring right back at her were these glowing red eyes. All she could do is watch in absolute horror as whatever this creature was circled their family home before going back into the darkness of the forest. Then in 1974, a 10-year-old boy said he saw a large black animal with glowing yellow eyes this time, a very different eye color than the rest of the reports, and he said that it was just staring at him through the window, only again to disappear into the forest. So this makes us all wonder, is the Black Shuck something real, or is it just a figment of our imagination? According to the church and religious folk, the Black Shuck is actually a hellhound sent from the depths of hell to hunt and scare people away from God and church. However, in 2014, a surprising discovery was made. The skeleton of a very large canine animal was discovered in Leiston Abbey in Suffolk, England. Many have speculated that this could have been the Black Shuck based on the skeleton size, because the animal must have weighed approximately 200 pounds and stood about 7 feet tall. Of course, skeptics will tell you that sure, this was likely just a very, very large dog, likely a Great Dane. And of course, it makes us wonder if the Black Shuck has been a very large dog this entire time. So what do you guys think is going on in Epping Forest? Is it truly one of the most haunted forests in the world? Is there a lot of traumatic footprint left behind on these lands just because of how much trauma and how many people have lost their lives on here? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. But that's going to do it for today's video. Thank you so much for joining me, guys. Don't forget to comment, like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.